Hello, everybody. Can you guys hear me in the back? All the way in the back? Excellent. Yeah, so I'm wondering if, I'm glad to see you all, and I'm wondering if, if this title is strange or provocative. What does this mean? What are we talking about? Hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll be able to actually have a really rich conversation about this. So part of this, I think, is I want to actually challenge everybody in this room to think about the future as it should be. And I'm going to start there by posing that question and kick things off with this idea, this concept, this belief, really, in the idea of something being better. So what does that mean? Last year I was reading an article in the New Yorker, and it was about Apple and Johnny Ive. It was kind of a behind-the-scenes look at an interview that really got into the process and sort of everything leading up to the Apple Watch. But it wasn't the article that really struck me. It was something that Johnny Ive said that really stood out to me. He said that so much of our manufactured environments testify to carelessness, and that things are developed to be different, not better. So this idea of being better, this really stuck out, and I was wondering, right, and asking myself, well, what makes something better? Specifically to, Johnny Ive, what makes, for example, the iPhone 6 better than the iPhone 5? Is it because it's bigger, it's thinner, it has better, a better camera, faster processor, more space? Like, why? What makes the iPhone better than the Nexus, for example? Which actually raised the question, too, of whether there's some intrinsic value in difference, in that we need to see the Nexus to understand and appreciate what might be better about the iPhone 6. But how do we make these sort of decisions and judgments, right? How do we know when something is better? These are value judgments, right? We believe this to be better. But where do those values come from? Well, in design, we call it the human-centered design process, right? We talk about understanding other people's values and designing with those in mind. And there's a number of ways we do that, right? We immerse ourselves in their context, in their culture to the extent that we can. We interview them, we observe their lives, and really try to immerse ourselves in their world. We also empathize to the extent that we can with them by putting ourselves in their shoes, experiencing things as they might, but experiencing them ourselves so that we know, as close as much as we can, we know what it's like to live in their shoes. And we also co-create with them, right? We involve them in the process, so we're not just designing for them, we're designing with them and supporting them and sort of developing their own ability to design for themselves, right? So this is the sort of the human-centered design process. And what you might argue is, if we talk about those value judgments, right, when the decisions we're making every day, well, when we're designing for others, we want to design with their values in mind. But I have a problem with this. And the problem stems from this very, very basic idea, which is that we are human too, right? This guy has values and beliefs and desires and needs, and he comes with them to every situation he comes, to design for others. He comes implicitly with this bias, right? With this sort of a sense of what he thinks the world should be. And with this implicit bias, right, we need to notice it, we need to acknowledge it, and I would argue we need to go as far as to not only acknowledge it, but if we're going to responsibly design for other people, I believe that we should first know ourselves. So this is, okay, let's turn it around then. So, what do I believe in? Or hopefully all of you guys are thinking about this as well. To illustrate this, I want to think about sort of something this is actually happening a lot in San Francisco. And of course, San Francisco is an environment that's probably a little bit more extreme than other parts in the world, but it does give us some indication of kind of where a lot of this is going. And so I reflected on a few, services that I use. Things like Uber, Netflix. I use Amazon, and recently Uber launched Uber Eats, and they're able to deliver food as well now. And I thought about these services, and I pause and reflect on the teams, the people who are working at each of these companies. They're empathizing with the needs of their customers. They're designing really great product experiences. They're so compelling, and clearly because they have lots of people using them, including myself. But in isolation, right? In isolation, these products and services are really, really well designed. The only issue is that when you zoom out and you start to notice something bigger happening, that everything, right? Everything is starting to be really compelling, but also really frictionless, really easy, really convenient. There's something interesting that when you look at the aggregate of all of these, right, there's something different is happening. It's starting to make an argument for what the future should be, right? One where the world is a little bit more convenient, a little bit more easy. So to really demonstrate this, I love this tweet by Startup L. Jackson, who says, "The Uberification of everything is turning San Francisco into an assisted living community for the young. Hashtag young is the new old." So for those of you who maybe don't understand this, it feels like that. We're sort of, we're like old people who can't do anything for themselves, and so we just click a few buttons and everything happens for us. It's amazing, right? But it actually sounds like something else that's hopefully maybe familiar. WALL-E, right? I don't know if you've seen this film, but it sort of depicts a dystopian future, one in which people are gliding around in these really comfortable chairs. They're video conferencing with each other, even though they're sitting next to each other. They've got food, queued up in their on their menu there. And then you've got WALL-E in the middle with his little robot eyes looking extremely human and somewhat incredibly sad. And so I think this helps illustrate this point, but when we remove all friction, we're removing opportunities for self-reflection and self-discovery and personal growth. And the concern is that at scale, right, when you see all of those apps and products and services, and they start to really surround us, and there's almost no way, out of that, this can start to actually erode away the social values, the things that we care about in communities, and start to skew our lives towards intolerance or impatience, a lack of resilience, or an inability to navigate change. And so I come back to this question, right? Is this the future as it should be? And I think why this question is really interesting now is that, we once had long timelines where change was slow, and we sort of adapted at the same pace as human beings with the accelerating change of technology. Right? If you think about it, for us to get over things emotionally, it takes time. For us to physically change, it takes time. Right? Our physiology is much slower than the rate of technologies. And when we hit an elbow, a bend in this curve, right, this inflection point, something really interesting happens. Technology is actually accelerating faster than we can even adapt to it. And so we are, right, human, and we want this ease and this convenience. So it's very easy for us, right, to accept whatever comes our way because it's really compelling. So is this the future as it should be? And really, the nature of this question, right? I'm standing up here asking this, but like, who am I? Why should I? Why does it matter? Or I guess why am I up here talking about this? Well, I would argue that when we're being human-centered in our design process, when we're designing for others, it's our responsibility to ask this question, right? We are creating these products and services. We're putting them out in the world, and we're influencing lives. We're changing behavior through this. So now I'm going to turn it around to all of you and ask you, sincerely, what do you value? What do you think is better? Right? And I'm asking this because, I alone am not able to go out there and design for the world as it should be. Nor would I say that alone, right? That my values, the things that I believe to be true are enough, right? I think we need to be having that conversation. So, we're starting to see, right? We're starting to see the rise of this on-demand economy, right? It's maybe very concentrated in an area like San Francisco, but it's growing and it's becoming more present, even, in cities like Warsaw. And I think when you take this on-demand economy and then think about also in the decade ahead, we'll see much more in terms of automation. So companies like Google, Tesla, or Amazon in their warehouses. And when you bring those two together, that's a really powerful intersection of things, right? You have this need and desire, the ability to provide products and services that are, that provide this ease and convenience. But now you're able to do it with the cost effectiveness and the efficiency of automation. Something really, really powerful happens where you're almost disincentivized to not participate in a world where these things come together. And so I turned to Bill Buxton, the UX guru, and he asked this question too, right? He said, okay, now that we can do anything, what should we do? And so this is where I come back to the title of the talk. I think we should start to design this friction back in. So maybe this is a big provocative point, right? Design friction into our experiences, into our products, right? We're crazy, right? That's crazy. And let me be clear though, right? I don't mean make our products unusable like this, whatever this is trying to do. Right? I think this is demonstrating that point. Like, no, we don't want unusable products, right? Or in terms of software, right? We don't want unnecessary steps in an onboarding flow or make it really hard to find your primary call to action, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the friction that leads to self-reflection, that leads to self-discovery, and the eventual sort of personal growth. All right, so let me turn to Airbnb. So how many of you have traveled and used Airbnb? All right, that's great. How many of you are hosts, out of curiosity? Awesome. We got a few hosts as well. That's great. So one of the things at Airbnb, right, is that we focus on removing the friction online for hosts to be able to list and manage their spaces, as well as for guests to be able to book one, right? We just introduced in the last couple of years Instant Book, and it's increasingly becoming adopted by hosts. And for guests, that's one of actually the most, convenient kind of frictionless ways of booking a place, right? So then where's the friction, right? We're removing it online in service of something more meaningful. The friction of getting out of your element and going somewhere new, experiencing unexpected new things, that sort of sense of serendipity in a place that is new and maybe unknown to you. And when you compare this, right, to traditional accommodations, they've leaned on the side of the familiar, the comfortable, right? Anywhere you go, your expectations will be met because they've kind of created this pattern, this consistency. But this is comfortable by comparison to what Airbnb embraces, which is to celebrate the uniqueness of our listings, the sort of diversity of places that you can stay, the sort of authenticity and comfort of feeling like you're in a home, right? And something that maybe looks familiar but feels very different once you arrive. And so there's a bit of that kind of friction in that it's sort of familiar, but it's not. And so there's something to be discovered there. But if we only did that, right? If we only did that, travel could still look like this. You could still feel alone, lonely, lost, clutching one of those printed out, sort of guides to a city that you get from the hotel, the concierge, that really are just full of ads and big bus tours, and things that people probably don't really want to do, but it's actually hard, right, to navigate without something to help you. And this just happens to be one of the, more more scalable approaches. So what does Airbnb do? Well, we do one more thing, right? We introduce you to your hosts. That's a big part of the marketplace, right? We've got the host side and we've got the guest side, right? And at best, you have a connection with this host. It's an authentic connection with somebody who's a local person in this community. And through that connection, you might start to actually feel a bit of a sense of belonging. A feeling that, okay, yeah, I can connect with people in this new place. I can start to feel a little bit more calm and resolved in this, in the situation that I'm in. And start to see the world through their eyes, right? This is at best. Now, maybe it doesn't always happen, and we can continue to facilitate that process, but what we have found is something really interesting happens at this intersection. So, at the intersection of feeling out of your element, completely in this sort of unknown, uncomfortable place, and the sense of connection, the sense of belonging that comes from, right, again, an authentic connection with your host or with a local or with other travelers, something interesting happens. The conditions seem to be right for self-reflection and self-discovery. Now, if you've traveled, right, and hopefully you've experienced this, it feels like, you sort of reflect, you sort of pause and go like, I like this place. I could see myself living here. I feel like I have new friends, and it starts to kick off this sort of questioning, this like sort of line of questioning of like, well, who am I and what's my, right? Who am I at home and who am I here? I could reinvent myself. I could be anyone I want to be. Now, whether you do that or not, the point is that this is the self-reflection process, and it's kicked off, at least in this case, when these two things meet. And so then I put it out there that, this is one example, but I was actually hard pressed to find a lot of other examples, or like every example really reflecting this. And so why, right? Why aren't we seeing more examples like this? So I think part of it is that going back to the argument earlier about, about our technology, I don't think people turn to our products and services and the technologies that we use with this, right, in mind. We don't turn to it and ask for or sort of desire for it to add more friction to our lives, right? That would just be counterintuitive. Instead, we come with a sort of sense of, this desire for convenience and ease, right? And again, at best, our technology isn't just providing convenience and ease, it's actually providing for our needs and desires, whatever they may be. But technology has become really good at doing this, at providing the convenience and ease. And if you go back to that inflection point in the curve, we're actually starting to experience these cycles happening faster and faster. And as it happens faster and faster, our expectations go up faster and faster, right? As soon as something becomes easier, we expect it to be even easier the next time. If it's fast, we expect it to be faster. I mean, just to illustrate that point, right? If we lost Wi-Fi and signal right now, people would start to probably feel a little uncomfortable, right? Or if we couldn't catch that Uber and there were no taxis around and we had to walk out around in the cold, right? We'd start to feel a little uncomfortable because we've adapted to these cycles. And so it's hard. When you're caught in this, it's hard, right, to remove yourself for a moment and pause and reflect and ask yourself, is this, right? Is this really what I desire? Is this really the future as it should be? But interestingly enough, I was talking to a friend of mine, and it occurred to me that actually, as designers or as practitioners of the human-centered design process, so whether you're an engineer or product manager or CEO, right, you insert yourself into the lives of others when you practice the human-centered design process. You ask questions like, what do you desire? Now, maybe not literally, but that's essentially what you're trying to understand. And you want to get deeper. You want to understand the reasons why behind these needs and desires. But what's interesting, right, is as you insert yourself into their lives, you are a source of friction in their life. you're getting them to pause and reflect and think about what matters to them. And it's interesting, right? If we can do this, like not just me, but everybody in this room, that would be great, right? If we can insert ourselves into people's lives and help them reflect on what they value, that would be great. But the only problem is, as individuals, all of us, we're not scalable, right? This is not enough scale if we're truly going to influence at a mass level this conversation. But I think if you can design this friction back into your product, then you can be scalable. Okay, so how? It's a good question. I think I'm out of time. No, I'm kidding. I've got 4 strategies for how you do this. So again, this is kind of my perspective. These are my explorations. I think there's probably other ways, and these might not be the only categories or examples, but what I found is that if you can think through these lenses when you look at your product or your service, I think you might discover opportunities to design friction back in. So I'll start with designing for skill building. And I think this one's pretty straightforward. I'm going to turn back to, again, another example that's probably a lot more present in San Francisco and some other communities, but it's the sort of on-demand food delivery services. So what we're seeing right now is just any number of companies popping up that provide on-demand food and sort of delivered to you ready to go, ready to eat. Whether it's Uber Eats or Sprig or Caviar or Munchery or Postmates or right, the list goes on and on and on. And so if you imagine, again, kind of even going back, right, like when you're surrounded by all of these services, you start to think, well, of course I need to participate in this, right? It's like you're almost disincentivized to not. But in this sort of this constellation of products and services, there have been a few that have popped up that are actually doing something a little bit different. There's one called Purple Carrot, another one called Blue Apron, that actually does the model slightly differently. What they focus on is creating the recipes, in sourcing the best ingredients, in portioning things out for you, in delivering the food to you. But they leave one major step for you, right? They remove the logistical friction of making a meal, but they leave the last step for you, which is, right, to cook the meal yourself. And I think what's interesting about that is that leaves space, right, for you to have to chop the vegetables and to actually deal with the process, right, and deal with it, maybe actually enjoy it, right, as opposed to taking for granted this meal that's ready to go, bringing back a little bit of the process and the skill. So skill building, right, is an act of self-discovery. The things that you participate in, that you spend time developing, are a reflection of what you care about. They're a reflection of who you maybe want to be, or maybe who you are today. But if we can continue to, right, build skill back into our products, look for opportunities to do that, we can help people continue to pause and reflect on what matters to them. So that one's pretty straightforward. Second one, I think, is maybe you could argue self-reflection is a skill in and of itself, but I would argue, that we should look at it somewhat separately. And I have an example, but I'm not sure this is even the best example. It's very straightforward, though. There's a product called Unstuck, and what it does is it helps people who are feeling stuck in their lives, some moments where they're just not sure what to do, and they're not really even sure why they feel this way. They can turn to this product, and through a series of exercises, it helps people understand why they're feeling the way they do in this particular moment. They do that through a series of methods that are, both inspired by sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as even, I would argue, design methodologies. And questions like just asking you, how are you feeling in this moment? And if you can't self-identify what that is, they show you a series of cards. And you can say, yeah, I think I'm feeling that way. They tell you a little bit more about what it feels like to feel stumped or lost or overwhelmed. They also put sort of lightweight journaling in there, which is a known method in cognitive behavioral therapy for you to sort of process your thoughts and feelings. They do things like card sorting, right? As designers, this is one of our sort of methods in our toolkit. They use it as well, right? And they help you sort. Am I feeling like this? Is this me or not me, right? Look at a card. Is this me, not me? And what you arrive at is ultimately an archetype, right? A person whose behaviors and attitudes in this moment are a reflection of your own, right? This isn't saying that you are this person. You're not a drifter. But in this moment, you're behaving like one, or your attitudes are similar to a drifter's, right? And empowered now with this understanding of who you are in this moment, you can start to unravel steps to take to start to feel unstuck. And like I said, I think this is a great example of sort of an explicit or more overt way of doing self-reflection, but it's actually, this is difficult, right? It's there's even stigma attached to turning to a product that might be perceived as self-help or some kind of like psychological device, right? It's got a little bit of that stigma. So my question would be, if we value this, right, how could we be more subtle? How could we design self-reflection back into our products so that it doesn't feel like this big, heavy process? And I have to sit down, I have to start journaling, and I have to think about, what I care about, what's going on in my life. But rather, right, through just a great product experience, there's a way for me to reflect. One example that just occurred to me recently was that, I keep turning to things that, like in the personal financial management software space, there's products like Mint or any number of other things that always show you the same stuff, right? You see pie charts, you see budgets, you see trends of, your spending, and they're always putting them in the context of finances, of money, of numbers. But that's not actually necessarily the way that we think about money, right? We think about it in other ways as well. We think about the value that we get in exchange for the money. And I would argue that that is a reflection of the things we value, right? Where we put our money, what we spend money on, is a reflection of the things we care about. So how might finances, for example, or banking actually make their products maybe a more subtle tool for self-reflection that helps people actually understand what they care about and not just kind of judge them for that extra night out that they, the restaurant that they went to or the shopping spree, but help them contextualize that and maybe something bigger and more important. Okay, design for collisions. So my first example is Lyft, and actually Uber does this as well in some markets. And just to be clear, I don't mean car collisions. I mean collisions between people. So another way of saying this is, think about all of the moments when you interact with a stranger, or you're forced to be in a space where you become a circumstantial sort of neighbor with them. It could be in an elevator, or in this case, in the backseat of a car. So what this product is doing is it's helping people essentially carpool together. And according to Lyft, right, this is an opportunity to bring people together. They've gone as far as to create a sort of a feature set around helping people express themselves through profiles so that you're not just a stranger when you get in the car, but you can actually look ahead of time, see who the person is that you're going to meet, or maybe in the conversation, right, you can bring up one of these pieces of information that they put in their profile. So in an increasingly, right, isolated world, or an opportunity to feel isolated because we can choose, right, to be in the backseat of a car alone, this is an interesting option to bring that friction back in. And they actually talked about this on their blog. They said that, this is a big step toward their vision of reconnecting people and communities through better transportation, right? And I think this is actually a really great opportunity. I totally agree with them. Although I'd also be a little bit critical and say that, this was back in March 31st of 2015, and they really haven't, frankly, done much with that feature set since then, and it's been a year or so. And it just feels like it's actually been a missed opportunity for Lyft, because they're such a more human brand as compared to Uber. They really do have this vision of connecting people, and yet they really haven't totally fulfilled that promise. But if that example isn't, if that's not fulfilling, I've got another one. So what if we took a macro view, a big, huge, step back and, sort of reflect on a view that is as big as this, the Las Vegas downtown project. So if you're not familiar with this is Tony Hsieh from, he's the CEO of Zappos. He moved his headquarters to Las Vegas, and he also started a sort of an incubator for startups there. And what he says is, what he really thinks is important is this is all about maximizing collisions and accelerating serendipity. And what he's talking about is that in this context, right, if you're going to incubate startups and you want to create conditions for them to be really successful, right, how can you accelerate innovation? Well, innovation is accelerated through what he believes is through these sort of serendipitous collisions between people. So just like the idea mixer out there and all the collisions that are happening there and the conversations that are born out of that, if you bring people from different industries together and have them talk about their different perspectives, new ideas can be born out of that. So in the context of this, even here, right, this idea of collisions is a really important one. Okay. So my last example is to design for confrontation. And the word confrontation is maybe a pretty loaded and provocative one. I don't mean it in the negative sense of, starting a fight or an argument with somebody or anything like that. I mean it in the sense of confronting that which is difficult, that which you're afraid of, or whatever that may be, and being able to work through it and growing from that experience. So for this, I'm going to return back to Airbnb for an example. We recently ran a study on our platform to understand what would happen if we encouraged our guests to contact their hosts instead of contacting Airbnb for any of their issues and questions. So, right, think about that, right? We provide a support, customer support service, but we wanted to understand what would it be like if we encouraged guests and hosts, right, to resolve their issues directly. We had two questions specifically. We wanted to understand from the guest perspective, how would actually that support compare? So how would the support from your host compare to the support from an Airbnb customer service team agent? And from the host perspective, we wanted to understand, how would hosts feel if we were encouraging guests to reach out to them? So let's start with hosts. So our original hypothesis was that hosts would actually feel burdened, right? This is additional responsibility. We thought they would be burdened if we encouraged guests to reach out to them. But it actually turns out that, and maybe not surprisingly, hosts were actually, they were okay with it, and there was actually no impact on the satisfaction they had with their experience, their hosting experience, with the guests who didn't have any questions as with the guests who did, and who did reach out to them. Which makes sense too. I think a big part of our platform, what makes it so great is that the hosting community is so generous, and they really embody the sense of hospitality. So great to see that, right? No impact on satisfaction there. But let's turn to the guest side. This is more interesting, perhaps. We had a hypothesis that guests would not be able to receive the same high-quality support from their hosts as from our team of trained agents, right? But it turns out that guests actually were just as satisfied with the support they received from their hosts as with the support that they got from Airbnb. And I guess, if you think about that, that kind of makes sense too, because often hosts have so much more information about their listing or about their neighborhood or any issues, right, that they may have with the place or their experience. The host can often be the person who actually can help really resolve that. So that sort of makes sense. This final one, though, I think will hopefully resonate with this concept of confrontation, which is that we had this hypothesis that, for guests going to their host for support instead of Airbnb, this would actually negatively impact their trip experience, right? after all, they're having to actually confront, right, the host, the person they're staying with, or the person whose home they're in, for any number of things. What we found, though, was surprising. That actually getting help from their host was correlated to higher overall trip satisfaction. So I'm going to say that again. The guests who reached out to their host and received help from them had a higher level of overall trip satisfaction. Now, we're actually investigating this further. We really want to understand why specifically. But, right, our next hypothesis is that it has something to do with this idea of confrontation, right? It's difficult to confront and deal with and resolve an issue with your host directly because that's where the friction is. And it's easier to take this other path, pick up the phone and talk to an agent who will resolve it for you. But actually, in working through that, something happens. Perhaps there's a development in that relationship, a connection, or something that's forged that actually leads to, potentially, right, this overall higher trip satisfaction. So those are my 4 strategies, right? Designing for skill building, self-reflection, collisions, and confrontation. But I'll leave you with a thought experiment, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end of this for a little conversation, which is to go back to that scenario with Wall-E and that dystopian future, right, where the world is completely free of friction, right? We've achieved this. My question would be for you all is, what's the one thing, just the one thing that you'd bring back? I think that whatever that may be is probably the key to helping us all design the friction back into our products and services. Thanks.